Morning. This is an ancient word, Luke 14:1, 7 through 14, New International Version. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous."
The contemporary word today is from a book called Secrets of Divine Love, A Spiritual Journey into the Heart of Islam by A. Helwa. A man once asked a spiritual master, "What is there to gain from reading the Quran if we will never fully understand it? What is the point in reading the same book over and over again?" The old sage responded by taking the young man to a well, where he emptied a bag of coal and handed the dirty bag to the man. The sage told the young man to fill the bag with water. The man said, "But master, this is a cloth bag. The water will seep through the fabric." The old man said, "If you trust me, then do as I say," and he left. For the next few hours, the man kept filling the bag with bucket after bucket, only for the water to keep seeping through the cloth. By the time the sage returned, the man was exhausted and defeated. The sage looked at the empty bag and smiled. The confused young man asked, "Why are you smiling? I have no water in this bag." The old man replied, "Your bag may have not been able to contain the water, but over time the water you poured within it washed away all the darkness of the coal that had stained the bag, making the bag as beautiful as the day I bought it." It is similar to the Quran. You will not be able to contain the entire revelation, but the more you recite it and allow the vibration to flow through you, the more it will purify you. The revelation of God was not sent to give you something you do not have, but rather to remove every veil in the way of your seeing that you already are what you seek to become. The contemporary reading for today is from this wonderful book that I mentioned and read from just now, The Secrets of Divine Love, A Spiritual Journey into the Heart of Islam. The book uses the Quran, stories from ancient sages, and mystical poetry to try to deepen our connection to God. The author in particular draws on the poetry of Jalal al-Din Muhammad Rumi, the great Rumi as he's often called, a mystical poet born in Afghanistan in 1207 and who died in Turkey in 1273. The book's interesting. The author says at the very beginning in the introduction, "Although this book is about Islamic spirituality, I believe our experience of God is not confined to one tradition or philosophy. while I choose Islam as my faith, I offer these words from the Quran as a reminder of how much you are loved by God. I pray these words awaken your heart to fall deeper in love with Allah, God, Elohim, Yahweh, or whatever you choose to call the supreme eternal being who has infinite names but only one essence. This story of the sage resonated with me this week as I was trying to make sense of today's ancient word from the book of Luke. I read this passage over and over and over again, trying to understand why was Jesus so concerned with where people sat at the dinner table. What, in heaven's name, is this story about? What relevance can I draw from this, from our contemporary lives? What was I supposed to discern from this particular passage? And much like the sage telling the young man to continually pour water into the bag that had contained coal, after a little while, the layers of dirt began to lift, and I began to see a little bit, I hope, what the point of the story is. And that's what I hope to communicate to you this morning. This is very much a dinner story, and all of us know about dinner. In our house, breakfast is for me the most important meal for the day. In our family, Laura and I eat together most evenings, and we're very lucky to have most of our family close by, and we have regular family dinners too, as I'm sure many of you enjoy as well. It's a chance to catch up on our lives, to eat food, to share a glass of wine, to relax from the pressures of the day and the busyness of everyday life. We touch base about our hopes, our dreams, our fears. And in our family, it's not unusual to end the dinner with a highly competitive game of Uno. Jesus is also interested in food and dining. The book of Luke is replete with examples of Jesus at meals, sharing food. At least that's what we are led to believe from the Gospel of Luke. And indeed, in Luke 7:33, Jesus does not deny the charge that he enjoys his share of wine at many meals, unlike John the Baptist. In Luke's Gospel, it's very clear that communal meals provide a central setting for Jesus' mission. And the language of food often serves as a basis for Jesus' teaching. Eating is a sign of life, a sign of celebration, but also symbolizes the harsh realities of hunger and exclusion for the enslaved and the dispossessed. So in the passage we read today in Luke 14, we're presented with yet another biblical dining experience. This time, at the very beginning of the chapter, we're told that one Sabbath Jesus went to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees. They were watching him. Now, this immediately caused me to scratch my head. It seems very curious on the face of it. Why on earth was Jesus invited to a dinner of the Pharisee elite? Why did he say that he would go? Clearly he was invited, and clearly he didn't refuse the invitation. Jesus was, after all, living a life of relative material poverty and was certainly not part of the elite. But perhaps the ruler also invited insightful and popular rabbis of the time to enhance his after-dinner conversation, the sobremesa, as it's called in Spanish. So it's curious why Jesus would accept this invitation and go to this dinner. And it's very clear from the passage that Jesus this time has actually very, very little interest in the food. He is, however, very interested in how the guests choose the places of honor. His response, according to the seating arrangements according to Luke, is twofold. First, he tells a parable. The point of the story is to discourage his listeners from seeking the most prestigious seat at the table to avoid the humiliating situation of being displaced by someone of greater prominence. Jesus then reinforces this by advising how a person might obtain a greater seat of honor. They are told to take the lowest place so they might be elevated to a more honorable seat by their host. Jesus' summary comment to the parable is, in fact, one of the most popular and well-known phrases in the New Testament. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus' exhortation here is clearly to pursue humility, a concept with particularly important status connotations at the time. It's important to bear in mind that humility was not considered a virtue in the ancient world, far from it. Yet humility is the mark of the message of Luke. It's a mark of the followers of Jesus according to much of the New Testament. It's interesting that in this passage, Jesus doesn't seem to castigate the system of honor at mealtimes. Jesus doesn't attack the practice. Instead, he seems very familiar with it, very comfortable with it to an extent, and even assumes it as the highest and lowest seats clearly figure into his response. Jesus' advice and Jesus' comment seems to address how to navigate the social setting into which people have been invited. On the surface, this passage very much seems to be about dinner etiquette. It's in the second part of the story that things begin to shift. We hear a more radically inclusive message, one that addresses the very fabric of the honor and status structures of the ancient world. Jesus calls for the inclusion of those who cannot return the invitation: the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. In Luke, Jesus subverts the expectations that social payment and repayment, reciprocity, norms prevalent in first century Palestine, should govern in God's community. His promise in this passage is that God will repay such hospitality at the resurrection of the righteous. So what are we to make of this? Most of the parables in Luke are usually striking and memorable. We think of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. We could name a number of them, but I would be surprised if many of you mentioned this one. This one seems a bit low-key, a bit underpowered, a little bit everyday, really not that extraordinary when compared to some of the other parables. The parable is certainly grounded in the period of its own time. Meals were important occasions that highlighted social disparities and inequalities in society. Honor and shame were critical features of the ancient world, enforcing such social inequalities. It was very, very important to people to avoid shame. And this was simply not about avoiding embarrassment as we would understand it, because public shame had major consequences for both individuals and families, something that could negatively affect your business, the marriage prospects of your children. All kinds of opportunities in the world depended on honor and status. Jesus also begins to address directly the host, the Pharisee who holds the greater measure of control over the rules of the game for this particular meal. His advice to this figure of power in the story actually works to undermine the system that upholds status differences at dinner time. In ancient times, as in our own, one's place in the system was secured by inviting family, friends, and rich neighbors. Reciprocal requests would ensue as the public acknowledgement of an honorable person may bring its own rewards. And such social reciprocity is the backbone of a system endemic to the first century world and is probably still an important part of how we think of business and professional occasions. How many times have you gone to a wedding and looked at where people are sitting? A professional conference. Who's sitting where? Who's sitting with whom? Why were they put there and I'm down here? This isn't quite as far from our lived reality as we might think. We are still concerned with matters of status, of matters of recognition. I myself am guilty of this. I've been a professor at USF for 32 years. I have, in the parlance, seniority. So actually, I find myself occasionally a little offended when I see that an adjunct faculty member has usurped my place. And I'm thinking, well, I think I need to restore the world order here and exert my seniority. We've all felt that way. We all have got our image of our place, and we become offended when others transgress that sense of our social status and place. But Jesus goes deeper here. He questions the system. He exhorts the host not to invite friends, family, or the rich to meals because they can repay with the corresponding invitation. And we do give invitations expecting to be invited back at some time. This is an important feature of a wonderful little book by Marcel Mauss, who was a cousin of Emile Durkheim. He wrote a wonderful little book called The Gift, which was an anthropological study of gifts. And Mauss argued that the reason we give gifts is because we want a gift back. Oh, we tell our children at Christmas, you should give but not receive. No, said Mauss. We want a gift. Because gift giving and receiving reasserts the social connections and bonds, particularly in traditional society. Reciprocity is essential in cementing social relationships. It's not idle to consider that reciprocity, but Jesus is instead rejecting that perspective and calling for the inclusion of those who cannot return the invitation. Why don't you invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind? Why are you expecting a reciprocal invitation? Why not invite those who cannot reciprocate? To be genuinely inclusive. It's actually a fairly radical vision of how you might conduct your own social relationships. So how do we treat others? In modern societies where much of our public political rhetoric emphasizes, or at least used to emphasize, that we are all created equal, it's easy to miss the context of what Jesus is teaching in his own status-orientated and hierarchical society. The radical inclusion and hospitality that characterizes today's passage from Luke's Gospel constitutes a strong political challenge to the well-crafted and finely tuned social system of Roman-occupied Palestine in the first century. It was an oppressive system that attached moral significance and moral worth to economic wealth and privilege, where people living in poverty or dependent on any form of charity or public assistance were often stigmatized as immoral, lazy, indolent, or incompetent. Today we live in a society, I suspect, where many of us might feel as if we're going backwards. We witness increasing attacks on notions of equity and inclusion. Public policy and many private attitudes seem to find more ways and means to distinguish and separate people from each other rather than emphasize our common humanity and our mutual need to belong and have community. Jesus, it seems to me, in this passage is attempting to subvert all social systems that privilege the haves over the have-nots, that stop us from finding true fellowship with one another. Dr. Martin Luther King understood this. Our goal, he said, is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. This, then, would be a good place for me to stop. This is the message. Most of us here, I suspect, would embrace Jesus' call for radical inclusion to seek to change the social systems that oppress us. But I'm sure that many of us also feel that these days we're knocking our heads against a brick wall. Will our work, our activism, our struggles and resistance bring about the kind of subversion of oppressive social systems that Jesus worked against? I woke up this morning and read a column by Heather Richardson that I looked at, and this is the column for August 30th, 2025. Just a few days before Labor Day, a holiday designated to celebrate the importance and power of American workers in the United States, the Transportation Department announced that it has canceled $679 million in funding for offshore wind projects, and the Department of Energy also announced it is withdrawing a $716 million loan guarantee to complete infrastructure for an offshore wind project in New Jersey. These cancellations reflect the president's apparent determination to kill off wind and solar power initiatives and force the United States to depend upon fossil fuels. He refers to climate change as a hoax, says that windmills cause cancer, and falsely claims that renewable energy is more expensive than other ways to generate power. These kinds of stories we come again and again. How can we look at the message of Jesus and take encouragement? Let me end with another story from this wonderful book on seeking the divine. This maybe provides us with part of the answer. A king was once walking through a plantation when he noticed an old man with a white beard on his knees planting some seeds. He walked over to the man and said, "My kind father, what are you doing?" The old man smiled innocently and said, "Hello, my dear Majesty. I am planting tiny date palm saplings." The king was surprised and replied, "But father, doesn't it take 20 to 50 years for date palms to bear fruit?" The old man smiled as he replied, "Yes, my Majesty, that is correct." The confused king asked, will you ever be able to eat the dates from the trees you are planting?" The old man sweetly replied, "I will surely never reach the age to enjoy these fruits, my majesty. But I have eaten dates from the trees my fathers planted but never tasted. And so, by God's mercy, I too plant for those who come after me to one day enjoy." Jesus never gave up on his mission, even to the very end, an end that he could clearly see, and neither can we. The message of social justice, of working for a better world, is not just for ourselves, but for the people, the children, the generations that follow us.